They say curiosity killed the cat. I was the cat that night. It was a slumber party, one of those cliché teenage get-togethers where we dared each other to do the stupidest things. But this was different. We weren't talking about calling crushes or sneaking out. No, we were talking about Bloody Mary. "Come on, you scared?" Jenna teased, her voice dripping with mockery. I wasn't scared, or so I told myself. I was tired of being the one who always chickened out. I'd heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? But they were just that. Stories. Bloody Mary was a myth, a tale to scare children, right? "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll do it." The girls cheered as if I'd just won a gold medal. They led me to the bathroom, a tiny cramped space with a mirror that took up almost the entire wall above the sink. The overhead light buzzed faintly, flickering as if it, too, was scared of what was about to happen. They handed me a candle and turned off the light, leaving me in the glow of the flickering flame. "Remember," Jenna said, her voice now a whisper, "you have to say her name 3 times. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was just a game, nothing more. I looked into the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. "Bloody Mary," I whispered, feeling a shiver creep up my spine. The candle flickered as if responding to my words. The bathroom felt colder, the air heavy. "Bloody Mary," I said again, louder this time. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I could see my breath in the mirror, a thin mist forming in the freezing air. But I wasn't going to back down now. I took a deep breath and said it one final time. "Bloody Mary." The candle went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own panicked breathing. My hands fumbled for the light switch, but it was as if my fingers were numb, unable to find the familiar plastic switch. Then I saw it. A faint outline in the mirror, a figure standing just behind me. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst from my chest. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking the eyes. 2 burning red coals staring straight into mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey my commands. The figure moved closer, and I could see more now, long, tangled hair, pale skin, a gaping mouth twisted into a malevolent grin. Blood dripped from her eyes, leaving trails down her gaunt cheeks. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. I finally found my voice and screamed. The light snapped on, and the figure vanished. The door burst open and the girls rushed in, their faces a mix of concern and fear. I was shaking uncontrollably, my back pressed against the wall. They tried to calm me down, telling me it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew better. I had seen her. I had heard her. The night ended with me sleeping in Jenna's bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that twisted, bloodied grin, those eyes that bore into my soul. Days passed, and I tried to forget, to convince myself that it had all been in my head. But the nightmares continued, and strange things started happening around me. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes flicker, showing her face instead of mine. Objects in my room would move on their own, and I would hear whispers in the night, her voice calling my name. It got worse. I started seeing her everywhere, not just in mirrors, but in windows, in the darkness of my room, even in broad daylight. She was always there, watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I told my parents, who of course didn't believe me, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. They sent me to a therapist who tried to help, but nothing worked. One night, I decided I had to face her again. Maybe if I did, she would leave me alone. I went back to that bathroom, lit a candle, and stood in front of the mirror. "Bloody Mary," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Bloody Mary," I said again, feeling that familiar chill. "Bloody Mary." The candle went out, and she was there, as I knew she would be. But this time, she didn't stay in the mirror. She reached out, her cold, clammy hand gripping my wrist. I screamed, but no sound came out. The world spun, and I felt myself being pulled into the mirror, into the darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her face, inches from mine, her mouth forming a twisted, triumphant smile. When I woke up in a sweat, I noticed something was wrong. My reflection in the mirror didn't move. It just grinned back at me, blood dripping from its eyes. I'm trapped here now, in this mirror, watching the world go by, helpless. And she's out there, wearing my face, living my life. Don't play the game. Don't say her name, because once you do, she'll never let you go.
When I was 12, I made a promise I couldn't keep. It was a summer night, one of those sweltering evenings where the heat clung to your skin like a second layer. My best friend Lily was sleeping over, and we were bored out of our minds. That's when she brought it up. "Have you ever played Bloody Mary?" she asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. I shook my head. I'd heard the stories, of course, but I never had the nerve to try it. The idea of summoning a ghost in a mirror didn't exactly appeal to me. "We should do it," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Come on, it'll be fun. I dare you." I wanted to say no, but I didn't want to seem like a coward either. So, reluctantly, I agreed. We crept into the bathroom, giggling nervously. The house was silent, the only light coming from the small nightlight in the hallway. We shut the door behind us, the darkness swallowing us whole. Lily lit a small candle she'd brought with her, the flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "We have to say her name 3 times. I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. We both faced the mirror, the dim light reflecting our pale faces. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Lily could hear it. "Bloody Mary," Lily whispered. "Bloody Mary," I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "Bloody Mary," we said together, our voices merging in the oppressive silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle flickered, the shadows danced, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I almost laughed at how ridiculous it all seemed. But then the room grew colder. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it was being sucked out of the room. The candle flame stretched, twisting unnaturally, and the mirror... It changed. The reflection warped, the glass rippling as if it were liquid. I saw movement behind us, a dark shape that hadn't been there before. I turned to look, but there was nothing in the room. When I turned back to the mirror, she was there. Bloody Mary. Her face was gaunt, skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Her hair was matted, hanging in clumps around her face, and blood, dark, viscous blood, dripped from her eyes and mouth. She was smiling, a sickening, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. Lily screamed, dropping the candle. The flame extinguished as it hit the floor, plunging us into darkness. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and I jumped, scrambling for the door. But it wouldn't open. "She's here," Lily whimpered. "She's real." I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control them. Finally, I found it, and the room was flooded with harsh, artificial light. The mirror was just a mirror again, our terrified reflection staring back at us. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaking. Lily didn't argue. We ran out of the bathroom and didn't look back. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in my bed, too scared to sleep, too scared to even speak about what we'd seen. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of something in the mirror, just for a second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I would hear whispers when I was alone, my name being called in a voice that wasn't quite right. And Lily started acting strange. She became withdrawn, distant. She wouldn't talk about what had happened, wouldn't even acknowledge it. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking into mirrors, the way she jumped at every little sound. Then, one day, she stopped coming to school. I called her house, but her mum said she was sick, that she needed rest. Weeks passed, and still no sign of Lily. When I finally convinced my mum to drive me to her house, I was met with a for sale sign in the yard. They had moved away, and no one knew where they had gone. I never heard from her again. I tried to move on, to forget what had happened, but Bloody Mary wouldn't let me. The sightings in the mirror became more frequent, more vivid. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat with her name on my lips. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the cold touch. It was no longer just a brush. I could feel her fingers around my throat, squeezing, choking me. I was terrified, but what could I do? No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy, that it was all in my head. But I knew it was real. I knew she was real. And then, one night, she came for me. I woke up in front of the mirror, but my reflection wasn't mine. It was Bloody Mary. She gripped my wrist, whispering, "Come with me." I was pulled into darkness. The last thing I saw was her twisted smile. I woke up in bed, but she was there, watching with hollow eyes. "She's coming for me. Don't say her name or she'll come for you too."
It was the summer before high school when my family moved into the old house on Elm Street. My parents called it a fixer-upper with character, but to me, it was just creepy. The house was filled with strange noises, creaking floors, distant thuds, and the constant sound of wind whistling through unseen cracks. But the worst part was the mirror. The mirror hung in the hallway outside my bedroom, a large, ornate thing with an old, tarnished frame. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even centuries, and no matter how many times I asked my dad to take it down, it stayed. "It's part of the house's charm," he would say with a dismissive wave. The first night in that house, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the mirror's presence, as if it was watching me. When I finally did drift off, I was plagued by nightmares of a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, its face hidden in shadow. The next morning I mentioned the nightmare to my mum, but she just smiled and said it was probably because of the move. "It's just your imagination," she assured me, but it wasn't. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was my parents talking in their room, but as I listened I realized the sound was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the mirror. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed and slowly crept toward the door. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as I approached the mirror. I peeked around the corner and froze. The mirror was dark, as if it were reflecting a different room entirely. And in that darkness, I saw her. She was standing in the mirror, her back to me, her long dark hair hanging down her back. She was wearing a white dress, torn and stained with what looked like blood. My breath caught in my throat as she slowly turned to face me. Her face. I'll never forget her face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, and blood dripped from the corners of her lips. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. My body refused to obey me as she stepped closer to the glass, her hand reaching out toward me. "Let me out," she said, her voice soft but filled with malice. I snapped out of my trance and bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for it to open, but it never did. The next morning I told my parents what I'd seen, but they just laughed it off as a bad dream. I knew it was real, though. I knew she was real. As the days went by, the sightings became more frequent. I would catch glimpses of her in the mirror during the day, just out of the corner of my eye. She was always watching, always waiting. I started avoiding the hallway, taking the long way around the house to get to my room, but it didn't help. No matter where I went, I could feel her eyes on me. One night, I decided to face her. I grabbed a flashlight and waited until everyone else was asleep before creeping into the hallway. The mirror loomed in the darkness, a silent sentinel. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands shaking as I raised the flashlight. My reflection stared back at me, pale and terrified. But it wasn't alone. She was there, standing behind me, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were filled with anger, with hate. She raised her hand, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Let me out," she whispered again, her voice a hiss in the darkness. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I felt her cold breath on my neck, and I ran, not stopping until I was back in my room with the door locked behind me. After that night, I couldn't bear to stay in the house. I told my parents that I was too scared, that I needed to leave. They finally agreed, and we moved out a few weeks later. But the mirror, it didn't stay behind. My parents brought it with them, insisting that it was too valuable to leave. They hung it in the new house, right outside my bedroom. I tried to avoid it, tried not to look into it, but I couldn't help myself. Every time I walked past, I would glance at the glass, hoping not to see her. But she's still there, trapped in the mirror, waiting for the chance to escape. And one day, I'm afraid she will. Don't play the game. Don't summon her, because once you do, she'll never leave you alone.
I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I scoffed at horror movies, rolled my eyes at ghost stories, and laughed off the supernatural. So when my friends dared me to play Bloody Mary, I didn't hesitate. It was just a game. What could possibly go wrong? It was a Friday night at Sam's house, an old creaky place perfect for spooky games. Sam's older brother told us about Bloody Mary, stand in front of a mirror, chant her name 3 times, and she would appear. "That's it? Sounds lame," I said. "Then why don't you try it?" Sam challenged. "Fine, I will," I shrugged. So there I was, standing in Sam's bathroom with a flickering candle. The lights were off, and the guys waited outside, whispering and giggling. I took a deep breath and stared into the mirror, my reflection wavering in the dim light. "Bloody Mary," I said firmly. Nothing happened. "Bloody Mary," I repeated louder. Still nothing. The guys snickered outside, probably thinking I was chickening out. I rolled my eyes and spoke one last time. "Bloody Mary." The candle flickered, the flame stretching upward like a claw. The room grew colder, the air thickening around me. I stared into the mirror, waiting, but there was only darkness. I let out a breath and turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like rustling leaves. "Get out." I froze, my heart pounding. I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw her. She was standing behind me, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and blood dripped from her eyes, staining her white dress. But it was the expression on her face that terrified me the most. She looked desperate. "Get out," she whispered again, her voice hoarse. I couldn't move. Her reflection leaned closer, her cold breath fogging the glass. "He's coming," she hissed, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to leave. Now." My breath caught. She wasn't threatening me, she was warning me. I didn't know who he was, but the fear in her voice sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, dropping the candle, plunging the bathroom into darkness. I fumbled for the door, hands shaking, and finally wrenched it open, bolting out of the bathroom. "What the hell happened?" Sam asked, alarmed. I couldn't answer. My heart raced, my mind spun. All I could think about was the warning. Who was coming? And why was Bloody Mary so terrified? I insisted we leave the house, making up an excuse about feeling sick. The guys protested, but I didn't care if they thought I was being a wuss. I wasn't staying in that house a second longer. We ended up at my place, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her desperate warning. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a hallucination, my mind playing tricks on me. But the dread lingered. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and I heard footsteps when I was alone. The worst part was the mirrors. Every time I looked into one, I caught a glimpse of something. Someone just out of sight, a dark figure lurking in the shadows, watching me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started avoiding mirrors, covering them up, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me. Then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed. He was tall, his body shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see his face, but I felt his eyes on me, boring into my soul. The room was freezing, my breath visible. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. He didn't move or speak, he just stood there, watching me. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Finally, he turned and walked out, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found scratches on my bedroom door, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I knew then that Bloody Mary's warning had been real, and that I had brought something into this world that I couldn't get rid of. I moved out of that house as soon as I could, but no matter where I go, I can still feel him. He's always there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. If you're thinking about playing the Bloody Mary game, don't, because once you let her out, you might let something else in too.
I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I had promised my mum I'd stay home and finish my homework, but when my friends called me up and said they were having a party, I couldn't resist. I snuck out of the house, telling myself I'd be back before she even noticed I was gone. The party was typical, music blaring, drinks flowing, everyone trying to act cooler than they were. But as the night wore on and the alcohol started to take effect, someone brought up the idea of playing Bloody Mary. "Come on, it'll be fun," Megan said, her eyes shining with mischief. "Who's brave enough to try?" I should have said no. I should have laughed it off like I usually did. But something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the way Megan was looking at me, daring me to be the one to step up. "I'll do it," I said, trying to sound casual. The room erupted in cheers and laughter as they led me to the bathroom. It was a small, cramped space with a single overhead light that buzzed faintly. They handed me a candle and turned off the light, plunging me into darkness. "Just say her name 3 times, Megan said through the door, her voice muffled. "Then see what happens." I took a deep breath and stared into the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, pale and slightly distorted in the flickering candlelight. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, making my hands shake. "Bloody Mary," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing happened. "Bloody Mary," I repeated louder this time. The air grew colder, the candle flame flickering as if caught in a breeze. I could hear my friends giggling outside the door, but their laughter sounded distant, almost muted. "Bloody Mary," I said one last time. The candle went out. I was plunged into darkness, my heart racing as I fumbled for the light switch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely find it. Finally, I flipped the switch and the bathroom was flooded with harsh artificial light. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The mirror was just a mirror, reflecting my pale, frightened face. I almost laughed at how silly I'd been, getting worked up over nothing. I reached for the doorknob, ready to join my friends and laugh about how stupid the whole thing was. But the door wouldn't open. I frowned, twisting the knob harder, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been locked from the outside. I pounded on the door, calling out to my friends, but there was no response. The laughter and voices that had been so loud a moment ago were now eerily silent. "Guys, this isn't funny," I shouted, my voice tinged with panic. Still nothing. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I turned back to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw her. She was standing behind me, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Blood dripped from her eyes and mouth, staining her white dress. Her hands were clawed, twisted into grotesque shapes, and her mouth was twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. I screamed, stumbling backward and slamming into the door. The mirror shattered, shards of glass raining down around me, but she didn't disappear. She stepped out of the broken mirror, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. It was as if I had been cut off from the rest of the world, trapped in that tiny bathroom with her. She reached out to me, her cold, clammy hand brushing against my arm. I felt a surge of icy pain shoot through me, and I screamed again, tears streaming down my face. "Let me out," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. I shook my head, unable to speak, unable to move. Her grip tightened, and I felt the life draining out of me, as if she was sucking my soul through my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door burst open, and I was pulled out of the bathroom by my friends, their faces pale with fear. The room was filled with light, and the mirror was whole again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I knew she was real. I never spoke about that night again. I never played the game again, but the nightmares never stopped. Every night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, her face looming over me, her cold hand reaching out to drag me back into that bathroom. I don't know how long I can keep fighting it. I can feel her getting closer, feel her grip tightening around my heart. One day, I'm afraid she will succeed in dragging me back, and this time, I won't be able to escape. So, if you ever think about playing the Bloody Mary game, don't. Because once you start, you might not be able to stop.
It was a typical Saturday night, the kind where nothing exciting ever happened. My friends and I were bored out of our minds, flipping through channels on the TV and trying to find something to do. That's when Amy suggested it. "Let's play Bloody Mary," she said with a wicked grin. I rolled my eyes. "That's so childish." "Come on, it'll be fun," she insisted. "Or are you too scared?" I wasn't scared, at least that's what I told myself. I'd heard all the stories, of course, who hadn't, but they were just that, stories. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural. "Fine," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, "but don't blame me when nothing happens." We gathered in the bathroom, the four of us crowded into the small space. The only light came from a single candle that Amy held in her hand, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could see the excitement in their eyes, but all I felt was a growing sense of dread. "Okay, you know the drill," Amy said. "We say her name 3 times, and then she's supposed to appear." "Right," I muttered, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. We all faced the mirror, our reflections staring back at us. I could see the nervousness in their eyes, the way their hands trembled slightly. But I wasn't going to back out now. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. "Bloody Mary," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bloody Mary," we all echoed, the sound of our voices mingling in the stillness. "Bloody Mary," we said one last time, our voices merging into one. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle flickered, the air grew colder, but the mirror remained unchanged. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and turned to Amy with a smirk. "See, I told you it was just—" The mirror cracked. The sound was like a gunshot echoing in the small bathroom. We all jumped back, startled, as the crack spread across the surface of the glass, splintering it into a web of jagged lines. "What the hell?" I whispered, my heart racing. Amy didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as she stared at the mirror. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. She was there. Bloody Mary standing behind us, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in all the light. Blood dripped from her mouth and eyes, staining her white dress. Her hands were clawed, twisted into unnatural shapes, and she was reaching out toward us. "Run," I whispered, my voice trembling. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping us in the bathroom with her. The air grew thick, heavy, as if it was being sucked out of the room. The candle flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt something cold brush against my arm and I screamed, scrambling backward and slamming into the wall. I could hear my friends panicking, their voices rising in fear, but I couldn't see anything. It was as if the darkness had swallowed us whole. And then I heard her voice. "Why did you call me?" she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Why did you summon me?" I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could feel her presence, feel her cold breath on my neck, but I couldn't move. She was right behind me, her icy fingers brushing against my skin. And I knew that if I turned around, I would see her face, see those hollow, bloodied eyes staring into my soul. "We didn't mean to," Amy whimpered, her voice trembling. "It was just a game." "It's never just a game," Bloody Mary hissed. The temperature in the room dropped, the cold seeping into my bones. I could feel her anger, her hatred, pressing down on me, crushing me. I gasped for breath, but the air was too thick, too heavy. "I want out," she whispered, her voice filled with malice. "I want to be free." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The door flew open, and light flooded the room, banishing the darkness. I gasped, my lungs burning as I sucked in the fresh air. My friends were huddled in the corner, their faces pale and streaked with tears. We didn't speak as we stumbled out of the bathroom, too shaken to even look at each other. The mirror was whole again, as if it had never been cracked, but I knew what I had seen. I knew she was real. We left the house that night, and I swore I would never speak of what had happened. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, her voice echoing in my head, her cold fingers brushing against my skin. And I know that one day, she'll come for me. One day she'll drag me back into that bathroom, back into the darkness. And this time I won't be able to escape. So if you ever think about playing the Bloody Mary game, don't. Because once you summon her, she'll never let you go.
My little sister, Emma, was always fascinated by ghost stories, particularly Bloody Mary. Every night she begged me to tell her the tale, her eyes wide with excitement as she clutched her stuffed bear. I indulged her, thinking it was harmless fun. I always reminded myself it was just a game for her, nothing more. One day, I came home to an unusually quiet house. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and I found Emma standing in front of the mirror, her face serious, her hands clasped. My heart skipped a beat as I realised what she was doing. "Bloody Mary! Bloody Mary! Bloody Mary!" she whispered. Panic surged through me, and I rushed forward. "Emma, no!" I shouted, pulling her away from the mirror. She looked up at me, confused. "I just wanted to see if she was real," she said, her voice small. I knelt down, my voice trembling. "Don't ever do that again, Emma. It's not a game." She nodded, her lower lip quivering as tears filled her eyes. Guilt washed over me, and I pulled her into a hug. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I just don't want anything bad to happen to you." Emma nodded again, sniffling, and I led her out of the bathroom, trying to brush it off as a silly mistake. But that night, unease settled in my chest and wouldn't leave. For a few days, things seemed normal. Then, strange things began happening. Small at first, like flickering lights and creaking doors. But it quickly escalated. One evening, I found Emma in front of the mirror again. Her eyes were glazed over, her face expressionless. I called her name, but she didn't respond. My heart raced as I shook her gently. She blinked and looked at me with a distant expression. "What are you doing, Emma?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's talking to me," Emma replied, her voice flat. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's talking to you?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The girl in the mirror," she said with chilling innocence. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just her imagination. It was something darker. I tried to keep Emma away from mirrors, but they seemed to draw her in. Desperate, I started covering the mirrors, but it didn't help. Emma would uncover them, her obsession growing stronger each day. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Groggy and disoriented, I followed the voice to the bathroom. The door was slightly open and I could see Emma standing there, pale in the dim light. "Emma?" I called softly, but she didn't turn around. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The whispering continued, but it wasn't Emma's voice. It was someone older, filled with malice. "Come with me," the voice hissed. "Come with me, and I'll show you." I grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her away from the mirror. She resisted, her eyes still locked on her reflection. "No!" she cried. "She needs me!" I pulled harder, and she stumbled back, eyes wide with fear. I slammed the bathroom door shut, hands trembling. "Emma, you're not allowed in there anymore," I said, my voice shaking with terror. That night, I covered every mirror with blankets and towels, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if something was waiting in the shadows. A few nights later, I woke in a cold sweat to find Emma's bed empty. Panic surged through me as I raced down the hallway. I found her in the bathroom, the mirror uncovered. She was standing in front of it, hand pressed against the glass, eyes locked on her reflection. But it wasn't her reflection. It was the girl from the stories, the one I had told her about. The girl was pale and gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes. "Come with me," the girl whispered, voice echoing in the small bathroom. "Come with me, and you'll never be alone again." I grabbed Emma and pulled her away, but the girl's reflection didn't disappear. She stayed there, staring at me, eyes filled with malice. "Stay away from her," I shouted, voice trembling. "She's my sister. You can't have her." The girl's smile widened, and she pressed her hand against the glass as if trying to push through. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. I never told Emma what I saw that night, but I knew she felt it too. The darkness lingered in our house, in every mirror, every shadow. I couldn't protect her from it. A few months later, we moved out, hoping to leave the memories behind. But they never left me. Sometimes I still see her, the girl from the mirror, just out of the corner of my eye in reflections. She's always there, waiting, watching. If you ever think about playing the Bloody Mary game, don't. Once you summon her, she'll never leave you alone. And if she gets a hold of someone you love, you might never get them back.
We were in the middle of nowhere, spending a weekend at a cabin that my friend Lucy's parents had rented for us. It was supposed to be a girls' weekend, a chance to unwind, to escape the pressures of school and life for a few days. The cabin was cozy, nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. It was perfect. Or so we thought. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter, games, and more wine than we probably should have had. But as the night wore on, someone brought up the idea of playing Bloody Mary. I don't remember who suggested it, maybe it was Jess, always the thrill seeker, but the idea caught on quickly. Come on, it'll be fun, Lucy said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. It's not like anything's actually going to happen. I wasn't so sure. I had always been superstitious, and the thought of summoning something, even as a joke, made me uneasy. But I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I went along with it. We gathered in the tiny bathroom, the four of us crammed together, giggling nervously. The only light came from a single candle that Lucy held in her hand, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mirror above the sink was old, the glass slightly warped, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Okay, we all know the rules, Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper. We say her name 3 times, and then we see what happens. I nodded, feeling the knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I was already regretting this. Let's do it, Lucy said, her voice tinged with excitement. We all faced the mirror, our reflections wavering in the dim light. I could see the unease in their eyes mirroring my own. But we were committed now. Bloody Mary, Lucy said, her voice steady. Bloody Mary, we all echoed, the sound of our voices blending together. Bloody Mary, we said one last time, our voices tinged with nervous laughter. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle flickered, the air grew colder, but the mirror remained unchanged. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and turned to Jess with a smirk. See? I told you it was just... The candle went out. We were plunged into darkness, the sudden silence pressing in on us from all sides. I heard someone gasp, felt the panic rising in my chest as I fumbled for the light switch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely find it. Finally, I flipped the switch, and the bathroom was flooded with harsh, artificial light. But the mirror was still dark. Our reflections were gone, replaced by a void of blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I could see something moving in the darkness, a shadow that twisted and writhed, growing larger by the second. She's here, Jess whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey me. The shadow in the mirror took shape, forming into a figure, a woman, her face hidden in the darkness, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Why did you call me? She hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. We didn't mean to, Lucy stammered, her voice shaking. It was just a game. There are consequences, the figure whispered, her voice filled with malice. There are always consequences. The bathroom door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The air grew thick, heavy, as if it was being sucked out of the room. The temperature dropped, the cold seeping into my bones. I could feel her presence, feel her cold breath on my neck, but I couldn't move. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, her face becoming clearer. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and black. Blood dripped from her mouth and eyes, staining her white dress. Her hands were clawed, twisted into grotesque shapes, and she was reaching out toward us. I'm going to take one of you, she hissed, her eyes locking onto mine, and you'll never see them again. Panic surged through me as I grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her away from the mirror. We have to get out of here, I screamed, but the door wouldn't budge. The figure in the mirror laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. It's too late, she whispered. One of you belongs to me now. I watched in horror as the shadowy figure reached through the mirror, her hand passing through the glass as if it were water. She grabbed Jess by the wrist, pulling her toward the mirror. Jess screamed, struggling against the icy grip, but it was no use. Help me, she cried, her voice filled with terror. We all lunged forward, trying to pull her back, but the shadow was too strong. Jess's body twisted, her face contorting in pain as she was dragged closer and closer to the mirror. I'm sorry, Lucy cried, but it was too late. The figure yanked Jess into the darkness. Her screams echoed, then silence. The mirror showed only our terrified reflections. We left the cabin that night, never to return. Jess was gone. If you ever think of playing the Bloody Mary game, don't. The consequences are real.
It all started with an old mirror my grandmother gave me. She said it had been in our family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, and now it was my turn to have it. The mirror was beautiful, with an ornate gilded frame that looked like it belonged in a museum. I was hesitant to take it. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I hung the mirror in my bedroom, right above my dresser. It felt out of place in my modern apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to hide it away. My grandmother had insisted it was important, that it held memories of our family. The first night with the mirror was uneventful. I went about my usual routine, brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, all while trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being silly. But then, the nightmares started. Every night, I would dream of the same thing. A dark figure standing in front of the mirror, its face hidden in shadow. It would reach out to me, its cold, clammy hand brushing against my skin, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the fear lingered. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find the mirror covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I wiped it clean, but the dust returned the next morning. No matter how many times I cleaned it, the dust would always come back. Then, the whispers started. I would hear them at night, soft, barely audible, but they were there. They would start as soon as I turned off the lights, a faint hissing sound that grew louder and more insistent as the night wore on. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, malevolent. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the fear was growing. I started sleeping with the lights on, avoiding the mirror as much as possible. But it didn't help. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent. One night, I finally had enough. I grabbed the mirror off the wall and carried it out to the garage, intending to get rid of it once and for all. But as I opened the garage door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the reflection of the mirror, was the dark figure from my nightmares. It was standing in the garage, just behind me, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as it reached out toward me. I dropped the mirror and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whispers, louder now, filling the air around me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, clutching a baseball bat, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The next morning, I decided I had to get rid of the mirror, no matter what. I drove out to a remote area, far from town, and buried the mirror in a shallow grave. I didn't care if it was an antique or a family heirloom. I just wanted it gone. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. The nightmares stopped, the whispers faded, and I started to feel like myself again. But then, a few weeks later, I came home to find the mirror hanging in my bedroom, right where it had been before. I screamed, backing away in terror. The mirror was clean, not a speck of dust on it, but the reflection was wrong. The room in the mirror was dark, shadowed, as if it was part of another world. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the dark figure. It smiled at me, a twisted, grotesque grin that made my skin crawl. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if the mirror was pulling me in, dragging me closer and closer to the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I finally managed to break free, I ran. I left everything behind. My apartment, my life, everything. I couldn't stay there, not with that thing in the mirror. Now, I live in a small, run-down apartment in a different city, far from my old life. I've covered every mirror in the place, but I can still feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the chance to drag me back. If you ever think about playing the Bloody Mary game, or if you ever come across an old mirror that seems out of place, don't. Get rid of it, and don't look back. Because once she finds you, she'll never let you go.
My friends and I were always looking for the next thrill. We were adrenaline junkies, addicted to the rush of fear. We'd explore abandoned buildings, go on midnight hikes in haunted woods, anything to get our hearts racing. But we never expected our need for thrills to lead us to something so dark. It was Jessica's idea. She had heard about the Bloody Mary game from her older sister, who claimed to have played it when she was younger. "It's just a stupid game," she said with a smirk, "but I bet you guys are too scared to try it." We weren't scared. At least, that's what we told ourselves. We agreed to play the game, to summon Bloody Mary, to see if the stories were true. It was supposed to be just another thrill, another adrenaline rush. We chose the oldest, creepiest bathroom we could find, an old abandoned house on the edge of town. The place was falling apart, with broken windows and peeling wallpaper, but it was perfect for our purpose. We gathered in the bathroom, the four of us huddled together, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mirror was cracked, the glass covered in grime, but we could still see our reflections. "All right, let's do this," Jessica said, her voice steady. We all nodded, feeling the tension in the air. We knew the rules. Say her name 3 times, and she would appear. It was simple, but the fear was real. "Bloody Mary," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bloody Mary." We all echoed, the sound of our voices blending together. "Bloody Mary," we said one last time, our voices tinged with nervous laughter. For a moment, nothing happened. The air grew colder, the room darker, but the mirror remained unchanged. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and turned to Jessica with a smirk. "See? I told you, it was just..." The mirror cracked. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing in the small bathroom. We all jumped back, startled, as the crack spread across the surface of the glass, splintering it into a web of jagged lines. "What the hell?" I whispered, my heart racing. Jessica didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as she stared at the mirror. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. She was there, Bloody Mary, standing behind us, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in all the light. Blood dripped from her mouth and eyes, staining her white dress. Her hands were clawed, twisted into unnatural shapes, and she was reaching out toward us. "Run," I whispered, my voice trembling. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping us in the bathroom with her. The air grew thick, heavy, as if it was being sucked out of the room. The temperature dropped, the cold seeping into my bones. I could feel her presence, feel her cold breath on my neck, but I couldn't move. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, her face becoming clearer. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and black. Blood dripped from her mouth and eyes, staining her white dress. Her hands were clawed, twisted into grotesque shapes, and she was reaching out toward us. "I'm going to take one of you," she hissed, her eyes locking onto mine. "And you'll never see them again." Panic surged through me as I grabbed Jessica's arm, pulling her away from the mirror. "We have to get out of here," I screamed, but the door wouldn't budge. The figure in the mirror laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "It's too late," she whispered. "One of you belongs to me now." I watched in horror as the shadowy figure reached through the mirror, her hand passing through the glass as if it were water. She grabbed Jessica by the wrist, pulling her toward the mirror. Jessica screamed, struggling against the icy grip, but it was no use. "Help me!" she cried, her voice filled with terror. We all lunged forward, trying to pull her back, but the shadow was too strong. Jessica's body twisted, her face contorting in pain as she was dragged closer and closer to the mirror. "I'm sorry," I sobbed, tears streaming down my face. "We didn't mean it." But it was too late. The figure in the mirror yanked Jessica forward, pulling her into the darkness. Her screams echoed in the bathroom, and then she was gone. The mirror returned to normal, our terrified reflections staring back at us. We stood there in stunned silence, our minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Jessica was gone. She had been taken. We never spoke about it again. We couldn't. The guilt and fear were too much to bear. We left the house that night, never to return. But I know she's still out there, waiting for someone else to summon her. And if you ever think about playing the Bloody Mary game, don't. Because the consequences are real, and you might not be the one who has to pay the price.